This is the rail adventure to the Great White North. Talks about a trip I made up to the Northern Alberta Railways in Alberta in 1980. It's actually 82. I got the wrong date on the slideshow. Okay, why would anybody want to go to Northern Alberta in the winter? Well, if you're a school teacher, that's when your vacation is. So that's where your Christmas vacation is. So yeah, you might want to go up there in winter. But Fort McMurray, Alberta, and I know that map's a little bit blurry, but Fort McMurray is the line in the railroad going up the right side of the screen. And it is the northern terminus of the former Northern Alberta Railways, which it was absorbed by the Canadian National Railways in 1981. At that time, the Canadian National was still operating a twice-weekly mixed passenger and freight train from the outskirts of Edmonton to Fort McMurray. This was the second furthest northern passenger route in Canada, exceeded only by the Canadian National's line to Churchill, Manitoba. In the fall of 1982, I suggested to two friends of mine from Utah that we should visit Fort McMurray and ride its mixed train before it faded into oblivion. So these are my two fellow travelers. Merle Rollins Jr. on the left, a native of Bountiful, Utah, and a fellow investor with me in the Heber Creeper tourist line. That may be another, Saving the Heber Creeper may be another show in the future. But, and also Tom Cronkite, a native of Maine, and at that time a graduate student at Utah State University. So part one, getting there. Making our way north to Alberta. So our trip to get up to the farthest northern point that we were going to go on this trip required us first to drive from Logan, Utah to Calgary, then take a train from Calgary to Edmonton, and getting up there, as you'll see, we actually took a bus to get up to Fort McMurray. And there's a reason why we took the bus. So heading out of Utah, we pretty much parallel the Union Pacific secondary Salt Lake City, Butte, Montana line. After Butte, however, we were squarely in Burlington Northern territory all the way to the Canadian border. While it was not part of our trip, this photograph shows the only other Class I railroad in western Montana. It's the Milwaukee Road's a ghostly, abandoned passenger station in Missoula, Montana, next to its Pacific Extension main line. I think the Milwaukee Road had been abandoned very close to the time we went up there. So the railroad still looked like it was still there, and I can't remember if the signals were still working or not. We just kind of missed it. But after the Milwaukee Road, it was the largest abandonment in American history in terms of mileage. Milwaukee Road built a line out to Seattle and Tacoma about 1915, after the Northern Pacific, after the Great Northern, but they were also the first to go out of business. So, from Butte, we went up through Montana, and we crossed the U.S.-Canadian border at Sweetgrass, Montana, passing into Couts, Alberta. This is the interchange between the former Great Northern and the Canadian Pacific railroads. And this is such a great photograph. This, we talk about, railroad, the golden age of railroading, but look at that track. You can hardly see it. The rail is so relatively light and, just not well ballasted. And this was a fairly, major railroad. So railroading then was really, there was a lot more of it, but it was much more of an adventure too, especially if you rode it. All right. Let's see. This was a Canadian Pacific secondary line that connected with the Burlington Northern at Sweetgrass or Couts. From Couts, we still had another 200-mile drive to Calgary. This was a 2-day trip in both directions. And just to give you an idea what is out there at the prairies, well, there are elevators. There's a lot of grain and crops grown in Alberta. We're going to see a map a little later of Canada, and you're going to kind of see where the really fertile areas of Canada are. They're not in the east. On our drive to Calgary, we caught up with at least one Canadian Pacific freight on its way to the Burlington Northern at Couts. After arriving in Calgary, we gave ourselves enough time when we got there that we were able to check out their pioneering light rail line. I think Calgary, I can't remember if Calgary or Edmonton had the first light rail line in Canada, but in the early 80s, light rail was a relatively new thing, and this was really a pioneering piece of transit.
Do you know who made those?
It looks like, I want to say maybe Italian, but
Could they be Leyland?
that's very possible. I would certainly accept that, but you can just tell by looking at the design, it doesn't look like anything else, in North America. So, as we arrived in downtown Calgary, the eastbound Canadian had just arrived from Vancouver, sporting a freshly painted Canadian Pacific engine up front. To this day, I'm so happy they put this on. This engine was just gorgeous. I mean, look how it just came out of the paint shop. I don't know if they put it on to get it over the mountains, or if one of the VIA, rail units, died or whatever. But it was a happy day for me when I saw it come in with this up front. Siemens, thank you. Before Siemens probably had any plants in North America. Now, that is the Canadian Pacific, at that time, the Via Rail station. That is their station behind it. The thing that looks like a parking garage, not only did it look like a parking garage on the outside, it looked like a parking garage on the inside. It was really an unimpressive station. However, it was right downtown, and it was sheltered. Most of the train, a little bit of the train's going to stick out, as you're going to see in a minute, but there was nothing special about the Calgary station in any way, shape, or form. So now the Rocky Mountaineer, which still runs out of Vancouver, doesn't even go to Calgary anymore. The trains go to Calgary, but they pretty much kick everybody off by Banff. Okay, same day, other side of the terminal, other side of the station. Here's a pair of CP switch engines passing through Calgary Station, and that's the rear of the Canadian poking out of the station overhang below. So you kind of get an idea of how the tracks go into the parking garage under where I'm standing. And we're going to see a lot more of the Canadian here later in the show. This was the then modernized Via Rail Calgary waiting room and ticket office. It was clean, it was comfortable, it was heated. The plastic chairs didn't do much for the ambiance. It really looked more like a bus terminal. So, the following morning, this is a pair of rail diesel cars, RDCs or Dayliners in Canadian language, for Edmonton, sit alongside the Canadian inside of Calgary Station. Now, I'm going to digress a little bit here and talk about the Calgary-Edmonton corridor, and I'm going to compare it to the North Carolina corridor. So we're going to look at Charlotte to Raleigh versus Calgary to Edmonton. Okay, the distance between Calgary and Edmonton, 192 miles, is comparable to that of Charlotte and Raleigh at 173 miles. So the big difference is that in North Carolina, you got a lot of you've got a lot of constituencies between Charlotte and Raleigh. You know, you've got some very large cities and some not quite as large, but you've got a real constituency for the train. Calgary to Edmonton actually serves a bigger area, but that's only because Calgary and Edmonton were such large cities. Between them, there was one city of any size at all, that was Red Deer. So when Via Rail, now, first of all, for those of you who are not familiar with Via Rail is basically the Canadian Amtrak, okay? So Via Rail made the decision to discontinue the trains. Now, they had 2 trains a day each way between Calgary and Edmonton. That's one of them up there on the top. It was just a pair of RDC cars. And it was actually better service in 1980 than it was in the early 1971 when Canadian Pacific was still operating it. Canadian Pacific only had 1 train a day between the two. You know, Via did take it up to 2, but then they discontinued it altogether. So, but if anyway, there's a lot more pressure. First of all, it's apples and oranges. The line in North Carolina, as we know, is owned by the state of North Carolina. Gives them a lot of leverage, working with Norfolk Southern to try to get the trains scheduled. Via Rail didn't have anything like that in Calgary. It was owned by Canadian Pacific, and Canadian Pacific really, would have been just as happy not having the passenger trains on there. So, anyway, they no longer exist. It's just buses. But in 1982, we found a Calgary-Edmonton RDC train to be fairly well patronized. Unfortunately, Via had withdrawn the onboard food service several years earlier. That's the conductor kind of standing towards the rear of the car. He's standing where the counter used to be for the snack counter on the train. So there was only one large city between Calgary and Edmonton, Red Deer, 3rd largest city in Alberta, the only significantly sized city between the two of them. Our layover at Red Deer was billed as a refreshment stop. Unlike bygone times, the Red Deer refreshment stop involved a queue up at the hot and cold drink machines inside the station. So when you get on the Piedmont and you go back there and you see the free coffee and the vending machines and that, you think, well, not much, but it's a whole lot better than the Calgary-Edmonton passengers had. So that top picture is a great picture of what it was like before dining cars, when the railroad would stop for 20 minutes. You'd go in, you'd eat so fast you probably had indigestion the rest of the day. You'd rush back out before your train left. So from Red Deer, it was another 90 minutes to the Canadian Pacific station in South Edmonton. By the time we made our trip, the dayliners no longer served downtown Edmonton, and trains terminated at the South Edmonton station instead. So there's still a railroad. There was still a railroad station in Edmonton, but it was a Canadian National, and the Canadian Pacific had just gotten out of Edmonton. I'm guessing that the real estate prices. Edmonton's a busy, dynamic place, economy-wise. I'm sure it was much easier for Canadian Pacific just to stop at this station on the outskirts of Edmonton and forget going downtown Edmonton. So passengers connecting to Via Rail trains or intercity buses in downtown Edmonton could take the light rail transit from South Edmonton downtown, and that's what we did. So you have these 2 cities in Calgary that have great light rail systems, and there really hasn't been that much expansion of light rail in Canada since then. There has in Toronto. I guess there's some in Montreal too, but that's that's pretty much it. Now, the train service we were going to ride only operated 2 days a week in each direction. So for us to take the train one way and the train kind of came out as Fort McMurray, went to Edmonton, went back the next day. So it really didn't work. So we had to end up taking a bus. As it turns out, the bus from Edmonton to Fort McMurray was the nicest one we'd ever ridden. It had snacks, had movies, and that. You're going to see this is a whole lot, more upper class than the train that we're going to be riding here in a little bit. We went to our motel immediately upon arrival in Fort McMurray, slept soundly until early the next morning. So we're now at part 2, which is riding the former Northern Alberta Railways mixed train. That was not the day we rode, by the way. That was probably about 100 years before that. Obviously, there's no snow, and anyway, but the Waterways station was still there. Waterways was kind of on the outskirts of Fort McMurray. It wasn't downtown. The railroad tracks went there, but the station had always been there where the yard was. Up until the 1990s, the railroad actually continued into several miles north of Waterway to the Heritage Shipyard, where cargo, largely uranium, was transferred from river barges to rail cars. I think that is probably about the worst railroad job I've heard of so far, trying to transfer uranium, into open-top cars. It just sounds extremely unhealthy. So, and I don't think they were doing that at the time we were up there. So what was the economic driver for the founding of the town of Fort McMurray? 2 words: oil sands. Canadian oil sand is a mixture of sand, water, clay, and bitumen, which is a thick and heavy crude oil. This material can be reasonably described as nasty, and because of its sludge-like properties, was moved almost exclusively by rail until recent times. And the railroaders there could tell you some great stories about trying to load this bitumen into tank cars, and that it was a real process. I mean, even if it was warm out, the stuff was like mud. So, but the deposits in red on the left. Now this is crazy. Those deposits in red make up the 4th largest oil reserves in the world. They are a significant portion of the total Canadian exports. For those of you who may remember all the talk, and they actually started it, stopped it, and I don't know if it started up again, Keystone Pipeline running from Canada down to the Gulf of Mexico. That was built to move this heavy Canadian crude out of Canada.
The Chinese are taking it now.
Yes, yeah. All right, let me give you a brief history of the Northern Alberta Railways. All right, if you can see the map there, it's a little bit like a wishbone, with one line going off to the right, upper right, another line going way off to the left, okay? So the Northern Alberta Railways was actually construction of 2 separate railroads. The Alberta and Great Waterways Railroad, which was the one on the right, which reached Waterways in 1925, and then the Edmund, Dunvegan, and British Columbia Railway, which reached Dawson Creek, British Columbia in 1930. No relation at all to the TV show with Katie Holmes. So, but in 1928, the province of Alberta, these railroads, they truly went up to there was no development up in this northern Alberta at all. So these were really economic drivers, but kind of like when they built the Denver and Salt Lake Railroad, they were going into places where there was no freight traffic. The freight traffic had to be built after the railroad got there. So in 1928, the province of Alberta purchased, then consolidated the 2 railroads into the Northern Alberta Railways. This lasted for about another 3 years, and then the Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Railroads, who are competitors from one side of the Canada to the other. they both decided that for once they were going to cooperate, and so they jointly purchased the railroads from the Canadians, and up until the 1970s, well, I guess maybe early 80s, both the Northern Alberta Railways was a kind of an autonomous railroad owned by the two railroads, very much like the Winston-Salem southbound. And Gene's wondering, why is the McKean car there?
Maybe the Canadians bought some of those.
Well,
Maybe Pacific, I think.
while oil sand traffic was the primary driver for building predecessor Alberta and Great Waterways Railway, some of the railroad's first traffic was the shipment of live buffaloes. Herding buffaloes onto rail cars, I wish somebody had made a movie of that. I'm sure it was very interesting. I don't think they went as easily as sheep or cows. But the railroad was also an innovator in its reported use of a gasoline-powered McKean rail car. I found the reference to the McKean car in one of the histories of the railroad. I can't tell if they actually bought it or maybe they leased it from the Canadian Pacific or whatever. But when I was talking to Jim Overholzer, he said, "Oh, I bet that went through the big snows real easily." So I don't know. It has a good-sized snow plow, and you can see the thing. I'm not trying to give Gene's talk, believe me, but this thing has it's like a wedge. It's built like a wedge, and so you'd think it could go through the snow easily, but it was also fairly light. So
They have horrible traction in the winter. They used to park them in the winter.
yeah, Gene's got some great stories for us next month in the April meeting. So the Northern Alberta Railways remained jointly owned until the Canadian National purchased the Canadian Pacific's share in 1981, and they fully integrated the Northern Alberta Railways into Canadian National. The passenger train from Edmonton to Dawson was discontinued in 1974, and that was actually a legitimate passenger train with an RPO and Mail and Express and that. As far as I know, it was not a mixed train. It was trains 1 and 2 ran on a fixed schedule. The train to Waterways ran on a suggested schedule. But that train was discontinued in 1974, probably. Now, Dawson Creek is well known in Canada because it's really where the start of the Alaska Highway is. So, but I'm sure that it was the roadways that did this passenger train in.
Did you ride behind that engine?
Well, coming up. Just a second. I did something. Okay, now we're back to Fort McMurray. So a taxi picked us up at our motel and took us to the waterway station on the southern edge of Fort McMurray. Fort McMurray is far enough north that because of the weather, the taxi cabs in Fort McMurray were never turned off during the winter unless they were in a garage. So it was it was hardly any different than the time I went to Churchill, Manitoba. So, the cars just ran all the time. If you turned them off, it was a dickens to try to get them going again. And this was the Canadian National. It had been the Northern Alberta Railways freight and passenger office in the station there. Okay, so when we got there, our train was already made up in the yard and waiting to depart for Lac La Biche. Okay, so how do I say this gently? Lac La Biche translates basically into Bitch Lake. So I'm going to guess it was maybe named after a dog. But the train, it was only 300 miles, but because it had to do all the freight work in addition to running the passenger train, it was designed to get to Edmonton in 2 days. So what you did was you bought a ticket to Edmonton, you got to Lac La Biche, and then you had to make your own arrangements. And luckily there were some motels there, and not necessarily in town, You would spend the night in Lac La Biche, same crew, same train next morning, you took off again, did the rest of the trip. Here we are waiting for the highball south. Those are stove exhaust pipes on top of the cars. You can't see it, but what they did was they built, each one of these cars, they built a bay window on the side. You can kind of just see the bay. If you look at the car, you can see a kind of a reflection, and then there's two rig lights. That's the bay window that sticks out. You're going to see that from the inside here in a little bit. These cars were all the heat and power was operated by the oil stove on the car, and they had a generator that ran off the traction, the batteries from the movement of the train. So, rail enthusiasts visiting from the United States were a rare commodity. Passengers not visiting locally were a rare commodity. At that day we rode, Tom, Merle, and myself were the only passengers getting on. So, when they found out we were railway enthusiasts, the crew invited us up to the cab of the lead engine even before we left Waterways. So here I am sitting in the cab, we're getting ready to go, and the switchman's out there cleaning snow from the switch at the west end of the yard. We left on schedule, and we're heading south towards Lac La Biche before the sun even rose. Because we're very far north. This is December, and it's a short day anyway. It's even shorter farther north. So, because of the marshy tundra, telegraph and telephone poles on the north end of the line were all installed with braces. You couldn't just put a straight pole in, it would just sink down into the ground. So, on the Churchill line, it was actually tripods, but this you've got you still got the same sort of thing. You've got them braced up. Soon we were rollicking along at about 30 miles an hour. So the senior locomotive engineer was focused on his train, but he was still very accommodating towards his visitors. And this is a picture of him hard at work. And now all of the former Northern Alberta Railway locomotives were named for tribal chieftains. In this case, the lead locomotive was the Chief Duncan Tostowitz. So that was kind of a neat thing, kind of a neat acknowledgement of the role the indigenous tribes played up there, that there was certainly some respect shown towards them. Now, I want you to note that we have 4 locomotives, and there's a Canadian National as the 3rd locomotive. And we're going to talk more about the locomotives here in a minute, but at that point, some of the rail cars were still lettered for Canadian National. Some were still lettered for Northern Alberta Railways. Some were Northern Alberta Railways re-lettered to Canadian National. Some were just Canadian National locomotives that made their way onto the system. So it was very much fun for us to see this used, still in use, motorized Fairmont track speeder at the one small stop. Now this is great because this is a village where the crew, the maintenance crew lived in the village. This is what they'd go out and patrol the, I don't know how this thing did with snow drifts. I don't think it did very well, but it would not be the sort of vehicle you would normally send out after a heavy snowstorm, because you can tell it wouldn't get very far. Also, you'd have to be dressed to the nines to make sure you didn't freeze to death on it. Now this curve allowed for a good shot of our entire train. So we got our 4 locomotives. We've got, behind that we have 2 tank cars, 1 boxcar. We have a baggage express car. We have a passenger camboose and a crew camboose. So, what is a camboose? A camboose is a combination combine, and a combine is a joint passenger and baggage express car in one car. Usually the baggage would be up front, the passengers would ride in the rear, but it's also acted as a caboose. So the two cars, and in fact all the cars that they ended up on the Northern Alberta Railway had started off on the Boston and Albany Railroad in from the 1900s, made their way up to the NAR. 19th century railroading at its finest. Remember the bus? This was the seating in a passenger caboose. Now, it was nice and lit. It was daylight, so it was lit. It did have lights. It had a drop toilet, drop to the tracks, and it had a sink. And as you can see, the seats were the kind of where you could take the back of the seat and reverse them easily, so you could ride in either direction. But I would say that looks pretty Spartan. Fortunately, we didn't spend very much time in this car, as you're going to see. The third car was a Railway Post Office baggage express car, still lettered for the Northern Alberta Railways. It was in beautiful shape. It looked like they washed it every other trip. It was really nice to see that car. Much better looking car than the Combees were. But unfortunately, the postal railway service was history on this train by that time. So the car was just used for express traffic and baggage. Now, we weren't the only passengers that day, though. A young Indigenous mother, got on with her newly born infant. She was going to one of the flag stops. She was going between two of the stops on the train. She had the baby in the car seat, and she was kind enough to let me take a picture of our fellow passenger there. Now, when we got on the train, we found out that breakfast and lunch was served in the dining car. What was the dining car? The dining car was in the crew caboose. And for a relatively modest fee, the rear brakeman would actually serve as a cook, and he would prepare meals for us, and we paid him for them. And we actually, this was our dining car. This is our dining car section. It was just great. It really was. Thoroughly enjoyed ourselves. After lunch, it was time for some onboard entertainment. He had a blues harmonica, and he just played for hours. That was how he would look out the window every once in a while and make sure everything looked good, and then play the harmonica. So, again, just thoroughly enjoyed that.
Was that a passenger or a crew?
Yeah, that's our friend Tom. Pamela, just to remind you, remember Matthew who came to visit us in Norfolk? Matthew Cronkite, okay. The young man, really tall young guy. We took him out to lunch at MacArthur Mall. That's his father, Tom. So. Now the rear end crew did have some work to do, and they had more useful duties than just entertaining us. But when not needed by a railroad employee, the caboose's bay window had the best seat in the house. Halfway through the morning, the crew notified us that we were going to be parked for a while at a siding, so it was photo time. Cautiously, our power creeped into the barely visible passing track. Now, I was going to tell you about the locomotives. These are 6-axle locomotives. They are 6-axle locomotives because they have been designed to spread the weight of the locomotive out across it. If these were 4-axle locomotives, they would be too heavy for the light rail and the marshy tundra. So on these locomotives, the middle axle on each locomotive is an unpowered one. So these were called GMD-1s. Here I am supervising our passing train. Who knew I'd be doing this kind of work as a railroad employee a little over 10 years later? Not necessarily out in the middle of Alberta, but watching trains coming into the yard, letting the crew know they'd cleared the switch. So I'm not smoking, by the way. It was that cold out. It was soon apparent why we were parked in the siding. So here we are on the railroad. There's There's 2 trains a day on this, one going north, one coming south. And we're about to meet the northbound train. This was the northbound daily freight train from Edmonton. Remember, this train, the passenger train, only operates 2 days a week. The other 5 days of the week, it was strictly a freight train. It would kind of operate on the same schedule. And I had the best view of it from the front end of our parked southbound train. This was a whole lot more substantial train than our little, 7-car train was. I honestly do not know what was in these cars. I don't know if it was coal, it could have been aggregate, maybe it was still uranium. I don't know. I may have asked them at the time, but I didn't make a note of it. But in any event, because he was a much bigger train, he had the right of way on this day. You can clearly see how the bay window stuck out of the side of the window, stuck out of the side of the car in this. And because it was a regular freight train, the Fort McMurray train actually had a brand new picture window CN caboose on it. I'd like to think that the caboose was nice, but I suspect this CN caboose was probably pretty nice also.
They were the top of the line cabooses. They were made by the railroad.
And look they got a picture window on the rear. But they came out to wave, inspect our train as they went by us. So.
The Canadian unions and the company got together to design those.
Oh, okay. Now heading south, most of the stops were at indigenous villages. In a roadless town this size, which is a few houses, the twice weekly arrival of the southbound mixed train was a big deal. In this case, a couple of people and their dog came out to see us. So our stopping point for the day was supposed to be Lac La Biche, Alberta. Maybe not Canada's friendliest town. What happened was, we got off the train, and I'd never had this happen to me before. I'm a high school teacher, so I'm used to working with young people. And we got off the train, and there's a group of kids, and they're probably about a block away. And they used a very obscene term, which I'm not going to repeat, and said, "Hey, get over here," like somebody, tell you to get over here, and so they can lift you of your wallet. Well, we chose not to get over there, but we found out that Lac La Biche is known because it has the regional juvenile detention facility for youths. And as far as I could tell, they were the ones running the show in Lac La Biche. And Lac La Biche did not have a police department. They had a Mountie, had a Canadian RCMP person. There's not much crime in Canada. They don't. There's a reason why they don't have big police departments and that. But this was the most out of control experience I've ever had arriving in a new town. So when the crew offered us, they said, the 2 guys up in the cab, they're both locomotive engineers. The one crew guy can go off duty. The other guy has not been working as an engineer. We can take the train into Edmonton. And we thought, I guess we can pass on spending the night in Lac La Biche. And so we made the decision to go straight on. So we found out that about a month before we got there, the yardmaster in Lac La Biche had chased a bunch of these juvenile delinquents out of the railroad yard. That night they came back. There were a couple of those caboose cars parked in the yard there. They came back and broke all the windows, got on the cars and trashed them. That was their way of getting back to the yardmaster for kicking them out. And I thought, this is truly a town where the inmates are running the asylum. So anyway, it was fairly, we were into the afternoon, so it didn't take long for the sun to go down. And we enjoyed a cozy evening traveling the remaining 126 miles to North Edmonton. We arrived at the Dunvegan Yard Station in North Edmonton, where we bade goodbye to our friends on the train. We were right next to a mall, of all things, and we're like 5 miles from downtown. So we're right next to the mall, so the yardmaster had, it wasn't going to mean anything to tell them we're at the train station because they want to go downtown. We just told them to go to the mall and pick us up. So luckily, they did that before we froze to death. There were still a few things open in North Edmonton, but our primary interest was getting into the hotel for some sleep. Part 3 of my talk. We are now off the Northern Alberta Railways. We are going to travel on Via Rail during a 1980s reduction spiral. This was the very comprehensive Via Rail system in 1982. You still had, think of Canada as having 2 railroads that parallel each other and compete for a lot of the biggest customers, Canadian National and Canadian Pacific. There were still extensive passenger train service on both railroads' main lines between Halifax and Vancouver, or St. John and Vancouver. In 2026, this is what we have today. Only about half the network still exists, since Via pulled service on virtually all of the Canadian Pacific routes. Again, just check that to that. So, fortunately, since we made this trip in 1982, there was still service on all of the above lines, including daily Canadian service via the original Canadian Pacific route from Toronto to Vancouver. That would not last. The next morning, we made our way from North Edmonton to the Canadian National's 26-story local headquarters and station in downtown Edmonton. And this was actually the base of a 26-story building. It's one of the bigger buildings in Edmonton at the time, but Edmonton's gotten really, Edmonton's like the Houston of Canada. It is just it really is a boom town. And at that time, Canadian National had a lot of interest in owning a lot of real estate. And so anyway, like Calgary, the passenger station was at the base of the office tower. In 1982, there were still nominally 2 transcontinental routes between Montreal and Toronto and Vancouver. Again, one going via the Canadian National, one going via the Canadian Pacific. This is the truncated Edmonton-Vancouver section of the supercontinental waiting to depart Edmonton. The supercontinental was the Canadian National's crack train between Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. It competed with the train they call the Canadian. The time we got there, you could still do it, but it was not a through train anymore. You had to take 4 separate trains if you wanted to go from Toronto to Vancouver via the Canadian National route. This was actually the nicest train of the 4. It still had sleeping cars, a dining car. I don't think we had a dome car though, so. So, again, when the station in Edmonton was put into place, Canadian National still had 2 daily passenger trains. They had the Panorama, they had the Supercontinental, every day of the week between Montreal and Vancouver. Plus they had locals all up and down. So Edmonton was a busy place. There were a bunch of these dayliner cars that went out to different places, nearby. So the Canadian National Station in Edmonton was like the Via Rail station in Calgary. It had gotten the same kind of decoration job. The only difference was they kept the benches instead of plastic seats. So it looked a little bit more like a railroad station. It was. Now, to go from Edmonton to Winnipeg on the route of the former Supercontinental, you had to take 2 separate trains, separate equipment, and separate train numbers. This is the Supercontinental on the right that's heading west now to Vancouver. This is our train that's heading east to Saskatoon. Now, the Edmonton-Saskatoon train, the former Canadian National coaches, were very comfortable, nice cars. And Via Rail had a very friendly cafe car attendant who served a menu somewhat similar to an AM cafe car. So there weren't any hot meals prepared, but she would heat stuff up in a microwave, or maybe it was like one of those Stewart's sandwich machines that we used to have when, kind of a broiler thing. At one point, we took to a siding to let the 3-car western counterpart of our train pass us. So I was happy I got that picture. In 1979, the Supercontinental took 8 hours to travel the 323 miles from Edmonton to Saskatoon. In 2026, the Canadian is scheduled to take 10 hours. They've kind of been losing some ground there. Now, since there were 2 separate trains between Edmonton and Winnipeg, this trip now required an overnight stay in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. In a precursor of what would happen in Edmonton, Saskatoon's Canadian National Station was located well outside downtown. It was 5 miles from downtown. And that was because in these two cities, Canadian National had a route that went through the middle of the city, and they'd also built a freight bypass. Eventually, they got tired of maintaining the route through the city to serve the downtown station, and they just built a new passenger station on the freight bypass. Saskatoon proved to be a very busy and attractive city, but because we got in there late at night and left early in the morning, didn't see too much of it. So the following morning, we were back at the Saskatoon station for the trip to Regina, Saskatchewan's second city. Our next day's train was a single coach and a baggage express car, plus a steam generator car. Its route would be over the Canadian National line from Saskatoon to Regina, and then they would switch to the Canadian Pacific Main line to Winnipeg. We got off at Regina. So on the west side of Regina, the route from Edmonton tied into CN's secondary line from Regina to Moose Jaw. So figure the Canadian Pacific Main line runs between Regina and a place called Moose Jaw. Canadian National has their own line from Regina to Moose Jaw. This was it on the left. But these are not mainline tracks. These are secondary lines, and this was unsignaled territory. I don't remember, how fast we went. I'm sure we probably didn't go much over 40 or 50 miles an hour on this, but this is where the line from Saskatoon came in and joined the one from Moose Jaw. So as we pulled through the Canadian National's Regina yard, we received a full court inspection on our 2-car train. Now going through Regina Yard, we see, voila, Canadian National 6-axle GMD1 locomotives, the same model as those used on the Northern Alberta Railways. CN had the same problems that the NAR did. Soft terrain, light rail. It was just not a well-built railroad. And so if you wanted to get a locomotive with any real power to it, and it didn't weigh too much, you had to send out these 6-axle special locomotives. So we arrived at Regina's Union Station on time and really had, I think, half a day left for some sightseeing in Regina. By the way, on this train, we have a F7 streamline locomotive up front. There's a steam generator car right behind it. It looks like a box car. It's got a generator car in there actually, this generator car is what provided the heat and the lighting for the passenger cars, because the locomotive did not have a steam generator in it. So among the sights to see in Regina were an ample number of Canadian Pacific freight trains passing by on the adjacent CP main line. Regina's Canadian Pacific built Union Station was magnificent. Nice building. Like many of the larger city Canadian stations, it also served as divisional offices, in this case for the Canadian Pacific. This building is now part of the burgeoning downtown Regina scene under the name Casino Regina. So I guess it would be like Casino Royale, but it's not in Monte Carlo. So being winter, there wasn't too much activity going on in the maybe not very well planned downtown pedestrian mall. So the three of us spent part of our half day in Regina visiting the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Heritage Museum. There was no sign of this erstwhile Mountie, however. It's actually a very interesting museum. We returned to Regina Union Station well in advance of the westbound Canadians' departure because we really didn't have any other place to go, but there wasn't much happening there either. But the wait was worth it. We were excited to finally board Via Rail train number 1, the Canadian, still operating with mostly Canadian Pacific equipment and running over the entire Canadian Pacific main line between Toronto and Vancouver. And if you can read the sign, it says Canadian for Swift Current, Calgary, Vancouver. After boarding the Canadian, we stowed our bags in the sleeper and made our way to the train's social center, the bullet-shaped dome observation park car at the rear of the train. Now, before retiring for the evening, I arranged with our porter to let me go into the large station during our stop at Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. What was interesting about Moose Jaw? Well, Moose Jaw is where the Soo Line Railroad came up from the United States up through St. Paul and then over through North Dakota and connected up with Canadian Pacific. The Soo Line was actually owned by the Canadian Pacific Railroad. So Moose Jaw had a large yard there, and all the traffic that was going to Western Canada out of the Chicago area in the Midwest on the Soo Line would come up to Moose Jaw. Had a beautiful large station, had this great map, and I wish I had taken a picture of the map. I did get a picture of the sign inside the station. This it's running into the station did give me a chance to run back out, get one last nighttime photo of the Canadian waiting to depart at Moose Jaw, and you can kind of see the round end observation car there. So after a good, if short, night's sleep, we were among the first patrons into the dining car for breakfast the next morning. This is all these trains we rode, this was the only one that had a real dining car, which thankfully began serving prior to our arrival in Calgary. Still using the wood stoves, the special log stoves on the dining car too. It smelled delicious. It was wonderful. Having missed dinner on the train the previous evening, we appreciated the chance to enjoy a delicious full breakfast on train number 1 prior to our arrival in Calgary. And getting back to Calgary, we bid a fond farewell to the Canadian, began our 900-mile 2-day journey back to Utah. I had no idea I'd ever see this train again. Thankfully I did, but it wasn't on the Canadian Pacific tracks. Phoenix. On our return home, we came through downtown Butte, Montana, passing the boarded up Northern Pacific Station. I had actually stopped at this station and gotten off 6 years earlier on Amtrak's North Coast Hiawatha. North Coast Hiawatha only lasted about 2 years after I rode it. I learned quickly, and that was one of the reasons we made this trip to Northern Alberta. I learned quickly, you cannot assume, being a rail enthusiast, that there is a really interesting train to ride. Do not assume that it's going to be there, next year or the year after. I mean, it seems like it may, but sometimes it isn't. Okay, I'm going to close with some random thoughts. In 1982, the Via Rail was providing a viable service over 2 routes in Western Canada on a daily basis. In 2026, service is now provided on 1 route, 2 days a week in each direction. Today's Canadian now travels entirely on the former Canadian National, bypassing the tourist and commercial hubs of Thunder Bay, Calgary, Banff, and Lake Louise, while still serving Saskatoon, Edmonton, Jasper, as well as the rail connection to Prince Rupert. So there is still a Canadian, you can still ride it, but it's not how the original Canadian Streamliner was designed. It was designed to go from Vancouver to Toronto and Montreal on the Canadian Pacific. The Edmonton-Calgary rail corridor was a textbook example of how much easier it is to remove rail passenger service than to restore it. You know, ever since VIA took those trains off, there have been intermittent attempts to try to re-establish the trains. They're just really hard to put on. Once they come off, they may come back, but it's not going to be easy. Finally, the former Northern Alberta Railway's Fort McMurray line is still in service. About a decade after we rode it, CN shortlined part of it. They actually abandoned part of it. The last part of it going up to Fort McMurray was actually, I don't know if it was torn up or whatever, but it downgraded so much that the CN ended up buying it back. They had to rebuild it, but it is now an integral part of the Canadian National. So, with that in mind, I'm at the end, and I thank you all for your patience. So.
That sounds like a great trip.
It really was.
You obviously had a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It's too bad you can't, they would never let you get into the cab nowadays.
Oh, no, no.
Too much
They let us get into the cab at Waterways. I understand getting down the way a little bit. You know, they didn't care if the train master saw us or not. It was great. And they were just, they were as friendly as they could have been to us. So I did make a point of sending them some photographs when I got home.